Welcome to Norfolk Wine and Spirits, Norfolk Whiskey Group. We have a very special guest today, Mark McLaughlin from Old Line, American Single Malts. We had a very good tasting, chatted for the last 2 or 3 hours on a range of topics. You know, we discussed whiskey, obviously, the world of whiskey, different spirits, different countries, how spirits evolve. So tell us about yourself and how you got into whiskey. But before that, what were you doing so that we can get to know you?
Sure. Well, thanks, Bikram, for having me here. This has been a great night. So my background prior to the whiskey world was actually in the Navy.
Navy.
Yes, sir. So I was my business partner and I. His name's Arch Watkins. We used to fly together for about 10 years. And then
You're flying in the Navy.
Flying in the Navy.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not the smartest way to make a living, but it was wonderful. Loved it. And then we got civilian jobs. Arch was an engineer, and I was in finance.
Okay.
It wasn't quite what we wanted to do, and there was always that kind of urge, that itch to have our own business, and we both loved whiskey and whatnot. And eventually, in 2014, we decided, if not now, when? And we quit our jobs with the idea of starting a distillery. And what we didn't know at the time, we set out to make bourbon and or rye.
Okay.
And at the time, we weren't even aware that American Single Malt existed. And,
Okay.
and just by serendipity, a few months or a few days later, rather, we encountered an opportunity to actually learn to make American Single Malt whiskey from 2 gentlemen who were looking to retire. So it was a right place, right time kind of scenario. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Who were the 2 gentlemen and what was the distillery?
So they were called Golden Distillery or Golden Northwest Distillery. They were
Okay.
out of near Seattle, about
Okay.
90 minutes north of
Okay.
Seattle. And they were 2 Vietnam veterans, 1 Army, 1 Navy,
I
and
see.
they had retired to the same neighborhood in their late 60s. And they got bored and decided to make whiskey, and they bought a little 60-gallon pot still, and they were
Okay.
making this American Single Malt before anybody else was doing it. And what precipitated the fact that they wanted to sell their business was that one of the 2 gentlemen was diagnosed with a terminal illness.
Oh no.
So he had a lung condition that was terminal. So they decided that they didn't want this distillery just to go away. They loved their product. They wanted to pass the torch. So we went to a distilling conference, linked up with them, and we're veterans, they're veterans, and
Yeah. So the instant connection.
instant
there.
trust
Yeah.
and connection.
Yeah.
And we eventually moved out and lived in Bob's guest house and learned how to make his whiskey, and from there the rest is history.
So this is 2004.
2014.
2014.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And then
So they have been distilling probably for some time. at that
they
time.
started in 2008. So they had about
2008,
6 years,
6 years, okay.
enough to work the heaviest, the biggest kinks out.
Mhm.
What they gave us was a wonderful whiskey, but it still had a little more, some rough edges on it to work
Okay.
out, and
Right.
and we think we've since worked on doing that.
Overcome them.
Yeah.
Okay. So they must have some whiskey that was aging too, right?
Yes,
so
sir.
did you incorporate that? Is that what you started your first release, or
I did-
how did
We did, exactly. So
Okay.
our initial, so when we took over the business, we moved out to the West Coast and we learned to make whiskey with Bob. So when we moved back to Baltimore to work near our home and released our first whiskey, that was a combination of what we produced, and what Bob had already produced before we even knew him.
So when you produced, that was produced in Seattle?
Yes,
I
sir.
mean,
Yeah, in Washington State.
In Washington
Yep,
State.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay. I see.
And
Okay.
then we relocated back to the East Coast, and as I was telling somebody else earlier, we thought we'd be up and running in 3 to 4 months. And the reality of opening, it's an industrial operation. There's red tape. There's all these things. There's
Right.
investment. It took us years to get open, so we found a wonderful opportunity in Ohio with a place called Middle West Spirits. And those guys are great guys, and they allowed us to make our whiskey with them on their equipment.
I see.
So it was a combination of contract and gypsy distilling, but it was it's a learning experience for us. We got to learn from those guys. They've been at this for a while.
Right.
But really what we have come to do is essentially, what we're trying to do is take the American single malt category is new, it's undefined, and still basically trying to find its way. And our vision for American single malts is embrace the American side. It's take that virgin oak aging, that bourbon style aging, to really put the fingerprint on that whiskey. But where we differ from a bourbon is that a bourbon on the back end delivers with that corn sweetness,
Mhm.
and we come in with toffee biscuit, malt, dark chocolate. And as much as we love bourbon, we are just beautifully different.
Of course, yeah.
And that's the direction we're going.
Okay. Yeah. So at this time, most of the whiskeys are 2014. By the time you start, 4 to 8 years old, or
Right now, what you and I are drinking today is
Yeah.
4 years old.
Yeah.
And then what we think our sweet spot is going to be ultimately here is going to be 6 to 8 years.
6 to 8 years.
6 to 8 years, yeah.
Okay.
With virgin oak, number 3, number 4 char.
Okay.
Some barrels will go longer,
Okay.
but 6 to 8 I think is going to be our sweet spot. The 4-year-old we're drinking is in a 30-gallon barrel.
Okay.
So it's a little bit more aggressive oak
Mhm.
extraction, but the 53-gallon barrels, yeah,
Yeah.
6 to 8.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So and all the distilling is done in still in Ohio
Both in Ohio and Baltimore.
and Baltimore.
Yep,
Okay.
both locations. Yeah.
So are you thinking of continuing that, or are we going to transition to back?
We're going to continue that. Yeah,
Okay.
we've determined that Baltimore is going to be where we do. So in Ohio, we do a combination of column distilling
Okay.
and pot. So it's
Okay.
the first run is column, second run is pot.
Okay.
In Baltimore, it's all pot.
Okay.
So there's a different character to it as it comes out. They're similar, but not quite the same.
Mhm.
So we're doing in Baltimore is a lot of our specialty runs, the peated malts. We do what's ultimately going to be our non-peated bottled and bond. That's going to be out of Baltimore.
Okay.
And for our flagship line, that'll most likely be Ohio for quite a while.
Okay. So you're not blending them together, or are you blending them?
We're not actually. And to your point, we can't because as a single malt, it's
It's
still one distillery.
blended
So
malt then. Okay. yeah.
exactly. So and we are open to doing blended malts in the future, but right now we keep the stock that we distill in Ohio, we keep
Mhm.
separate from the stock we distill in Maryland.
Hmm.
And they're aging in the same warehouse, but we just make sure that we don't marry them together unless we do it deliberately.
Right.
So they can still.
That'll be a great marriage, right?
It
Could
could
be
be.
interesting
It
marriage,
could
yeah.
be absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So what about the malts? Are the malts the same in Ohio as well as
They are.
Baltimore?
The mash bill is the same. Yeah,
Nice.
it's about 90% a Copeland 2-row pale malt. So the pale malt is kind of the engine behind the fermentation process. And we have 10% of it is called a C120 crystal malt. And the crystal malt, for those people who aren't familiar, when the barley is malted, in the drying out process, a crystal malt is dried out at a higher temperature and it caramelizes some of those sugars.
Right.
So you get a lower alcohol yield, but you get
Okay.
a really nice dark chocolate,
Right.
rich toffee character.
Right.
So for us, we use that. That is one of the differentiators for us, is that we have that really, really nice dark chocolate note, which I think complements all the other stone fruits and vanillas and caramels you get from both the malt and the barrel.
Yeah, okay. What about the yeast strains? Are you using the similar or same yeast strains in both distilleries?
We are actually. We used to use 2 different yeast strains. They're all commercial off the shelf, but there's, as you know, there's thousands, right? And now we actually ended up going down to 1, which we found was just more efficient, and the flavor profile was the same or better.
Very consistent.
Very consistent, absolutely.
Mhm.
We're not doing champagne yeast like some do, but no, we're doing a great ale yeast, and it's working out really well.
So have you experimented with other yeast strains, or would you, or is that not really practical at this point?
We haven't, well, with the exception of taking the 2 strains down to 1, we haven't experimented with a lot, and simply because right now, what we were kind of gifted with this business was a process that worked, and we love it. So for us, our job as a business now is scalability, and scaling in a way that quality stays the same and gets better and better.
Mhm.
We do experiment, but right now yeast is not something that we have tinkered with.
Okay.
Barrel finishes,
There's so much you can do.
different cuts on distilling, but
Yeah.
right now the yeast is something we've kept constant.
Okay, good. So 6 to 8 years is more like based on history as to how it worked for the folks in Washington
In
State.
Washington, well, they were doing smaller barrels. They were 2 to 3 in a little tiny 10-gallon barrel. But for us, as we track along what we're doing, our 10-gallon barrels, 2 to 3 years, our 30-gallon barrels, 3.5 to 5.
Yeah, right.
It just seems that kind of trend line is going to 6 to 8 on the 53s.
Okay.
Right now, our oldest 53s are about 5.5.
Okay.
Where they are now is that right now they're more stone fruit forward than they are vanilla. And I think we
Okay.
want the vanilla and caramel to catch up a little bit to kind of stay in line with our flavor profile that we've established.
I see.
So we think 6 to 8 years will be kind of the right spot for those.
Okay.
And of course, we want to identify some barrels that are going to go 12, 15.
Right.
But you have to pick those barrels. You have to do that very deliberately, because if you pick the wrong barrel to go 15 in America with virgin oak, it can be an oak bomb, and you don't want that.
Yeah. So the size of the barrels, right? A lot of people experimented with that, and obviously you get a lot of extraction initially.
Sure.
A smaller barrel. Have you reached an optimum, like, 30 gallons is the best, or the 53 gallon?
53 is, for us,
Yeah.
53 is the best. I mean, 30 gallon, the juice we're putting on now, we think is we love it. It's amazing.
Okay.
With a small barrel, what you gain, which you probably know, is you gain that rapid oak extraction.
Mm.
But what you have to sacrifice in a smaller barrel is oxidation.
Okay.
And just that breathing of the barrel,
Mm.
and all the amazing chemical transformations that can happen from that.
Right.
And even with a 30-gallon barrel, there's a high limit, right?
Right.
5 years, you're tempting fate at 5 years,
Okay.
right? With not over opening the whiskey.
Right.
With a 53-gallon barrel, even a heavy char, you should be safe to go, 6, 7, 8 years. But right now, we think those 53s, the complexity, as you go from a small barrel to a larger barrel for longer, in my opinion, you go from one-dimensional to many-dimensional.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're seeing now is each iteration that we go from smaller barrel to bigger barrel, we're getting more complexity,
Okay.
and really more interesting whiskey.
Right.
Yeah.
So, are you releasing whiskeys from Baltimore at this point, or not really?
We have.
You
We
have?
in
Okay.
Massachusetts right now, it's all stuff that we distilled in Ohio. But within the next, not too long, we should have some stuff in Baltimore, which it'll be interesting to see what the flavor profiles. I think it'll be a little, probably a touch more old world style.
Okay. What does that mean?
A little more stone fruit, a little heavier, a little
Oilier, maybe?
maybe a little more floral. Yeah.
Floral,
But
okay.
it'll remains to be seen exactly how it comes out of the barrel. But
Okay.
yeah.
But you have released them. They are available
We've
in
done
other
some
markets.
private barrels in the home market
In the
with
home
some of the
Okay.
the pot distilled stuff. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Well, the other thing, like a lot of the whiskey, folks who are here and otherwise, they love barrel finishes, like sherry cask,
Mhm.
port cask, Madeira cask, rum cask, you name it. There are all kinds of cask finishes, mezcal,
Sure.
cask even. How do you approach that? Are you looking at that? I know it can be very complex for somebody really trying to define their taste profile, and it's much more complex for you folks because you're doing it two different distillates working with that.
Sure.
So what's your approach there?
It is we're embracing it. One of the beauties of barrel finishing is that, in my opinion, within reason, if you're putting a good distillate and good juice in the finishing barrel, it's very unlikely you're going to ruin the whiskey. You can change the yeast, you can ruin the whiskey. You can change the distillation process, you can ruin the whiskey. You can change the fermentation temperature, you can ruin the whiskey. If you're putting a good product into a finishing barrel, you can ruin it, but it's a low risk way to innovate. So we're doing, we found is that with our distillate, with the strong vanilla caramel notes and things, anything stone fruit heavy is going to be wonderful.
Okay.
So the tawny port, Oloroso sherry is great. We haven't done any Pedro Jimenez yet. Madeira is great. We haven't tried any Cabernet or things that are a little bit more acidic and citrusy, and well, not citrusy, but more fruit bombs we haven't done, but more that oxidative kind of thing, where Madeira and port and sherry has done beautifully.
Really?
Caribbean rum finishes great.
Really? So a lot of these wine finishes are French oak too?
Yeah, the ones, absolutely. You get a little spicy character out of that. Yeah.
Characters.
We have an Armagnac barrel that has a wonderful spiciness.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So I mean, Mark, it would be great if we can get some barrel samples, and we'd love to taste. I know you would like to come back and kind of share with us, right?
I would love to. Yeah, I'm not mailing those. I'm driving those up.
You're driving those up.
Yeah.
So no, it's really wonderful. I wish you all the best. You're doing some really fantastic things.
Thanks, Bikram.
It's a tough category for sure, Mark,
It certainly is.
But with people like you driving this, you are the pioneers for American single malt. Wishing you all the best.
Thank you.
for
I
spending
appreciate
time.
this very much.
Yeah.